Recently, I saw that another Catholic YouTuber, who shall remain unnamed, was selling a course on the relationship between logic and apologetics for nearly $100. I've for some time been interested in scholastic logic and even wrote a small catechism on the issue, so this piqued my interest. Upon looking into the course, I was shocked. The entire course was a collection of explaining what are called informal fallacies, or as they are commonly called, logical fallacies. This may come as a surprise to some, but these informal fallacies are, in the grand scheme of traditional logic, quite unimportant. In fact, in all my reading of traditional scholastic theology, I've almost never seen one of these logical fallacies ever used to reply to an objection. Further, many of these types of fallacies listed are not fallacies at all. For example, calling appeal to authority a fallacy is quite silly, since we have a whole religion that is founded on authority. And if you are really interested in learning about this is the type of information that you can get on Wikipedia, certainly not the type to pay $100 for. The situation in apologetic circles is grim. Rather than a direct response to another's arguments, the entire thing has become a game of playing counterexamples or other specious modes of refutation, with no concern to actually show whether and how the argument itself does not follow. Anyways, what I wanted to do in this video is to teach you the type of information taught in scholastic logic that is actually useful for refuting arguments for free. If you want to thank me for this, you can become a patron at patreon.com/MiltonThomist or give a one-time donation at christianbwagner.com/donate. But this video in its entirety is completely free. First, we will need to briefly deal with some fundamental matters in logic, and then I will give you an easy four-step process to evaluating and refuting arguments using the scholastic method. Before we get into refuting arguments, we need to understand what an argument actually is. If we reflect on our own process of knowing and reasoning, we will see that there are three steps. First, what is called simple apprehension. Here we grasp the concept of something before we affirm or deny anything about that concept. For example, if we were to grasp the concept of man, the expression of this concept is called a term. So first you have a concept, and then you express it, and this is the term. Second, we go in to make judgments about that concept. Here, we are really just combining two concepts together by the term is. So if I grasp the concept of, quote, man, and grasp the concept of, quote, Socrates, I could combine these two in the judgment that, quote, Socrates is a man. The expression of this judgment is called a proposition. So the judgment exists in the intellect, and then the expression of that is a proposition. Third, we go into reason by combining two judgments together in order to make a new judgment. Thus, we could have the judgment that, quote, Socrates is a man, and the judgment that, quote, all men are mortal, in order to draw forth the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. So in whole, this would be that Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Here we have a syllogism. In the intellect, this is called reasoning, and its expression is called a syllogism. So now what are the parts of a syllogism? In each syllogism, there are 6 terms and 3 propositions, because each judgment, as we went over above, has 2 terms. One is the subject, that is the first term, and this is joined together with the predicate, which is the second term. And it's joined together by what's called the copula, or is. The 3 propositions are called the major premise, which is the first proposition, the minor premise, which is the second proposition, and then the conclusion, which is the third proposition. And while I said there are 6 terms, we will see that each term is repeated twice. So we will say that there are 3 unique terms. First, we have the major term, which is the term uniquely in the major premise. Second, we have the minor term, which is the term uniquely in the minor premise. And then we have the middle term, which is both in the major and the minor premise and does not show up in the conclusion. So with our syllogism above, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man is the major premise. All men are mortal is the minor premise. Therefore Socrates is mortal, that's the conclusion. So Socrates, that's the major term. Man, that's the middle term. Mortal, that's the minor term. And each of these, as I said, are repeated twice. So now that we have all this out of the way, knowing the syllogism and the various parts of the syllogism, and then also the 3 steps in reasoning, at this point, you may be wondering, how can you say that the only way of arguing is a syllogism, since sometimes there are a lot of premises and terms in an argument, and at other times we only state one premise and then immediately draw a conclusion? The answer to this is that while other forms of argumentation may not look like a syllogism, no matter what, every single argument reduces to a syllogism, which brings us to our first step. When we hear an argument against Catholicism, we need to put it in a syllogism. There are usually 3 ways that arguments are stated which hide a syllogism. First, many people use what are called enthymemes. An enthymeme is an argument where only the major premise is stated and the conclusion is immediately drawn, assuming the minor premise. So, for example, if someone were to simply state Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, they would be assuming the minor premise that all men are mortal. An example of this that commonly comes up when talking to Muslims: Jesus never said, I am God, worship me, therefore Jesus is not God. What is assumed in this enthymeme is that in order for Jesus to be God, he must say, I am God, worship me, which is simply a false assumption. The ability to expose the hidden minor premise is one of the most important skills to learn. Second, many people use what is called an epikairema. An epikairema has a major and minor premise, but mixed into the argument is proof for the premises. This is commonly the practice of earlier scholastics. For example, if I were to say, Jesus is God, as is affirmed by the divine names given to him, he who is God is eternal, therefore Jesus is eternal. In my major premise, I added proof to the premise. While this can offer a more concise method, it is less apt for analysis. It is better to change the form into multiple syllogisms, which may require unpacking an enthymeme where the epikairema occurs. So, in our example, I would split it into two syllogisms, the second being referred to as the proof of the major premise. Syllogism 1. Jesus is God, he who is God is eternal, therefore Jesus is eternal. Proof of the major premise. Divine names are given to Jesus, divine names are given to he who is God, therefore Jesus is God. Or I could simply state it as an enthymeme. The proof given usually stands as the major premise, and the proposition it proves as the conclusion. Third, the dreaded sorites. This is, unfortunately, one of the most common ways of arguing, especially in modern philosophy. The sorites is one of the most dangerous ways of arguing as well, for it is very common to slip in sophisms into the long chain of reasoning. But the best way to defeat the dreaded sorites is simply to break it into a number of syllogisms. Here's an example of a sorites. Jesus is a man is a rational animal is one with intellectual powers, one with intellectual powers is one with a will, therefore Jesus has a will. We can split it up into a number of syllogisms. Jesus is a man is a rational animal, therefore Jesus is a rational animal. Jesus is a rational animal is one with intellectual powers, therefore Jesus is one with intellectual powers. Jesus is one with intellectual powers, one with intellectual powers is one with a will, therefore Jesus is one with a will. It is important to remember that the conclusion of each syllogism becomes the major premise of the next one. At this point, each individual syllogism and its connection to the next one can be critiqued. As you can imagine, this can be quite complicated. Often a sorites is mixed with an epikairema, or an argument is so remote from a syllogism that you need to read between the lines in order to discover their way of reasoning. But rest assured, every time someone gives an argument, it really is just as simple as them fundamentally taking two premises and making one conclusion out of them. Now to step 2. After we've turned whatever argument we are dealing with into a syllogism, we can now begin step 2. This step involves questioning the conclusion. The most important place to begin is to ask ourselves, does the conclusion of the syllogism contradict Catholic doctrine? If no, then there is no point in even continuing the conversation, except perhaps to have discussions on theological opinion. For example, Muslims may argue, Christ was born, therefore Christ is a man. We could turn this enthymeme into a syllogism, that is, Christ was born, one who was born as a man, therefore Christ is a man. But at the end of the day, we do not deny that Christ is a man, so we can simply point to this fact and move on. As a brief tip, it is important to remember that that which is defined and taught by the Church consists ultimately in judgments. For when we assent into the truth of something, we are assenting to a judgment, which can be stated in a proposition. Now, there are likely thousands, if not more, judgments which are taught by the Catholic Church at a number of different levels of authority. Throughout the history of the Church, many theologians sought to collect, classify, explain, prove, and defend these propositions in a systematic manner. The best example of this in English is called the Sacrae Theologiae Summa, written by a number of Jesuits in the 1950s, and can be very helpful for researching such questions of whether something has been taught or not. Anyways, now on to step 3. Let's say that after turning your opponent's argument into a syllogism, you have found that their conclusion is something truly which is contrary to Catholicism. Here we seek to look at the form of the argument, which is made up of the quote, mood and quote, figure of the syllogism. I will keep this as simple as possible, but this will get a little complicated. Basically, there are 4 types of proposition. First, the universal positive, which is usually given the letter A. An example of this is all men, so universal, are rational, positive. Then the second one is the universal negative, which is usually given the letter E. For example, no men are plants. Third, the particular positive, which is usually given the letter I. For example, some men are Catholic. Then the particular negative, which is usually given the letter O. For example, some men are not American. These types of propositions can interact with one another in order to draw forth conclusions, some ways in a valid manner and other ways in an invalid manner. Thus, the syllogism that every body is a substance, universal positive, every man is a body, universal positive, therefore every man is a substance, universal positive. Here, the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion are all universal positive. So this is referred to as a syllogism, because if you remember from above, universal positives are given the letter A. Or to give another example, we can have a syllogism that no man is a plant, every man is an animal, therefore no man is a plant. The major premise and conclusion are universally negative, and the minor premise is universally positive. So this is referred to as an EAE syllogism. This is called the mood of the syllogism. This treats the placement of the propositions in a syllogism by its quantity, universal or particular, and its quality, positive or negative. So anytime you have the mood of a syllogism, this is going to be referenced by three letters, either A, E, I, or O. But here things get tricky, for there are a number of different ways to order the terms of the syllogism as well, not only the premises. From the placement of the middle term in the syllogism, we can deduce four different figures. First, we have what is called first figure syllogisms. This is the most common type of syllogism out there, where the middle term is the subject in the major premise and the predicate in the minor premise. Thus, in the above example, we have no animal is a plant, every man is an animal, therefore no man is a plant. We see that the middle term animal is the subject in the major premise and the predicate in the minor premise, allowing for a nice cascade of the major and minor terms into the conclusion. Second, we have what is called the second figure syllogism. In this, the middle term is the predicate in both. No bitter man has peace, but every saint has peace. Therefore, no saint is a bitter man. We see peace is the predicate both in no bitter man has peace, and it's also the predicate in every saint has peace. Third, we have what is called the third figure syllogism. In this, the middle term is the subject in both. No animal is incorruptible, but every animal is a living being. Therefore, some living being is not incorruptible. We see animal in no animal is incorruptible as a subject, and animal in every animal is a living being is the subject. Fourth, we have what's called the fourth figure. This is also called the indirect first figure. In this, we switch around the placement of the middle term from the first figure. The middle term is the predicate in the major premise and the subject in the minor premise. All saints are godly men. No godly men are evil men. Therefore, no evil men are saints. We see that godly men is the predicate in the major premise, and it's the subject in the minor premise. Each one of these figures have a number of moods that are valid and a number that are invalid. For example, if we tried to give the following mood for the first figure syllogism, it would be invalid. If you remember, mood is just those three letters that we talked about. Some men are bankers, some men are kings, therefore some kings are bankers. In this case, it is perfectly possible that some men that are bankers and the some men that are kings are different groups of men. Out of the 64 possible combinations of moods and figures, only 19 come out as being valid. If you remember, A equals universal positive, E equals universal negative, I equals particular positive, and O equals particular negative. So the first group has 4 possible. The second has 4 as well. The third has 6 possible. And the fourth, or the indirect first, has 5 possible. There's a process of elimination that goes into deducing these 19 possible moods, but it is too long for this video. So after you have turned it into a syllogism and discovered that its conclusion is indeed against Catholicism, try to see if their syllogism is in a proper mood, which obviously you're going to look at which figure it is in, and then check it against the possible moods that are listed above. For example, if someone were to argue like this, some men are fallible, all the gospel writers are men, therefore all the gospel writers are fallible. They would be using an IAA syllogism in the first figure. This is a completely invalid manner of reasoning. Now to step 4. This is the final step. Here we have placed our argument into a syllogism, decided on whether the conclusion is even worth refuting, and looked at the form of the argument. Now we need to evaluate the matter of the propositions. Here we have three moves we can make. First, affirm. Second, deny. Third, distinguish. Let's say someone argues like this against us. No person who dies is God, but Jesus is a person who dies. Therefore, Jesus is not God. This is an EIO syllogism in the first figure, which is one of the valid forms, so it is solid in its form. Further, to say that Jesus is not God is a matter of Catholic teaching. In interacting with this syllogism, we can do three things. First, we could concede the major and minor premise. At this point, we would be conceding the falsehood of Catholicism. Or if the major and minor premise are correct and the form is valid, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Second, we could affirm one of the premises and deny the other, or we could just deny both. Third, we could distinguish. It is a rule of syllogisms that they must have only three terms. If they have four terms, then you suffer from the fallacy of equivocation. For example, if you said, all rational animals are men, no man is a woman, therefore no woman is a rational animal, clearly, while the conclusion may be correct, man is being used in an equivocal sense in the major and the minor premises of the term. The way to reply to this is by distinguishing the senses of the term in the major premise and then contradistinguishing the minor premise, showing that they are used in two different senses. All rational animals are men, I distinguish. All rational animals are men in the sense of human being, conceded. All rational animals are men in the sense of male, denied. Then we would treat the minor premise. No man is a woman, I contradistinguish. No human being is a woman, denied. No male is a woman, conceded. Thus, we see that the terms are used equivocally and contradistinguish. Further, sometimes we don't contradistinguish, but only distinguish one of the premises and then concede the other, distinguishing the conclusion as well. We can do either of these in the syllogism we are facing. No person who dies is God, but Jesus is a person who dies, therefore Jesus is God. First, we could contradistinguish this, which is the better option. We would say, no person who dies is God, I distinguish. No person according to his divinity, I concede. According to every nature that terminates in his personhood, I deny. Jesus is a person who dies, I contradistinguish. A person who dies according to his divinity, I deny. A person who dies according to a nature that terminates in his personhood, I concede. Then from this, you could simply deny the conclusion. Or, on the other hand, you can distinguish either the major or the minor term in the major or the minor premise, and then concede the conclusion in this distinguished sense. While this is a bit of an awkward way of speaking, I would concede the major premise and then distinguish the minor, saying Jesus is a person who dies. I distinguish a person who dies according to his divinity, denied, according to his humanity, conceded. Then we import this distinction in the conclusion, distinguishing it likewise. Jesus is not God, according to his humanity, conceded, according to his divinity, denied. This, of course, is an awkward way of speaking since God is usually spoken of personally. It is important to note that there is also a practice called subdistinguishing, where your distinction needs another distinction. I'll pass on this since most state it as an ordinary distinction, but if needed, it exists. Lastly, as mentioned earlier, one can straight up reject one or both of the premises, which will lead to a rejection of the conclusion. For example, if someone said, all true miracles are signs of the truth, but the holy fire is a true miracle, therefore the holy fire is a sign of the truth. In this case, there are two ways one could go about this. Either, first, one could distinguish the usage of sign of truth, since it is ambiguous, as I've spoken about in other places. Or two, one can simply deny the minor premise. At this point, one can either first bring forward your argument against the premise, or second, ask for evidence of the minor premise, then attacking this new argument if one is given. Thus, I would say that I concede the major premise, I deny the minor premise, therefore I deny the conclusion. And then after denying the minor premise, I could give my own evidence for why I think this is false. To give a little summary of the whole video, there are 4 steps to destroying incorrect arguments. First, you need to turn the argument into a syllogism, no matter the form that it's put in. Second, you need to investigate whether the conclusion is contrary to your position. Third, you need to investigate whether the figure and the mood of the syllogism is correct, using the lists given above. And then last, either deny one or both of the premises, and thus you can deny the conclusion, or you can contradistinguish both premises, showing equivocation, and then from this deny the conclusion, or you can distinguish one of the premises and then concede the other, and then from this, you will also distinguish the conclusion. By the way, if you want a little guide on this, my friends at profide.io have a logic poster, which is pretty cool. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, make sure to share, make sure to subscribe. And if you really, really like this, make sure to become a patron at patreon.com/MiltonThomist, or give a one-time donation at christianbwagner.com/donate. As always, God bless.